It seems that TransDigm sold a part called a non-vehicular clutch disc. You have to excuse how small the image is here, but it's up there on that screen. But if I blew it up much larger, it wouldn't even be to scale, because this disc is only about 3 inches anyway. A pair of jeans can cost $32. Imagine paying over $1,000 for that. But the good news here is that what I've found is that the cost of about 149 of these clutch discs will cost, at cost, is about $4,768, except TransDigm charged the public $215,007. That is a margin of about $210,239. Mr. Howley, are you aware how many doses of insulin we could get for that margin?
I'm not.
In a single-payer healthcare system, an insulin dose can cost about $137 a vial. I could have gotten over 1,500 people insulin for the cost of the margin of your price gouging for these vehicular discs alone. The incidence of diabetes, according to the CDC, is about 7 people in 1,000, which means I could have covered the insulin costs of a community of 21,400 people for the cost of your price gouging of the public on a non-vehicular clutch disc alone. I could have sent 21 kids to college. I could have sent 18 toddlers to free preschool for a year in the most expensive city in America. So my question to you is, why should we give you another dime?
It seems to me the government always has the choice of what to buy and what not to buy from us. We believe we provide the government with well-designed, well-manufactured, high-quality product. We deliver it in a timely fashion, and we support it when there's a problem.
How much competition do you have? How many competitors do you have in this market?
We have I don't know this individual part, just because we make 200,000 parts, but I would say there's almost no product we make where there aren't other alternatives to buy the part.
But it could be one alternative, 2 alternatives, or 1,000 alternatives.
Not 1,000.
Not 1,000.
Some number of alternatives.
So it's not a perfectly
always selected originally in a competitive process when the airplane's designed, where we're selected because of our price, our technology, our delivery, our contract terms, whatever.
You know, I find this interesting because this term free market comes up very often, but I don't think people really understand what that means, because so often it's not a free market at all. It's a captive market. It's one where we're forced to choose between 2 to 3 people. Oftentimes in these processes, there is significant argument and there's significant evidence that there's collusion in these markets, that it's not a perfectly competitive market, because a perfectly competitive market requires a large amount of competitors. Right now, Amazon can scan your face without your consent, all of our faces without our consent, and sell it to the government, all without our knowledge, correct?
Yes.
And, Mr. Chair, I'd like to seek unanimous consent on how Amazon actually met with ICE officials over a facial recognition system that could identify immigrants. I'd like to submit this to the congressional record.
Without objection.
Thank you so much. Ms. Garvey, in fact, it's not just Amazon that's doing this, right? It's Facebook, it's Microsoft, it's a very large amount of tech corporations, correct?
That's correct.
Do you think it's fair to say that Americans are essentially being spied on and surveilled on a massive scale without their consent or knowledge?
I would make a bit of a distinction between what Facebook and other companies are doing, but yielding to Ms. Buolamwini for more specifics on this. I will say most of the law enforcement agency systems operate on DMV databases or mugshot databases, so information that has been collected by agencies rather than companies.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Ferguson, one of the prime constitutional concerns about the non-consensual use of facial recognition technology is rooted or alluded to in the 14th Amendment, correct?
That's correct. It's one of them.
And right now, companies, governments, agencies can essentially steal or use your biometric data from you without your consent. And this is outrageous, right? Because this is America, and we have a right to privacy. Isn't that right, Ms. Koliani?
That's absolutely right.
Thank you so much. Ms. Bulamwini, I heard your opening statement, and we saw that these algorithms are effective to different degrees. So are they most effective on women?
No,
Are they most effective on people of color?
absolutely not.
Are they most effective on people of different gender expressions?
No, in fact, they exclude them.
So what demographic is it mostly effective on?
White men.
And who are the primary engineers and designers of these algorithms?
Definitely white men.
So we have a technology that was created and designed by one demographic that is only mostly effective on that one demographic, and they're trying to sell it and impose it on the entirety of the country.
So we have the pale male data sets being used as something that's universal when that isn't actually the case when it comes to representing the full sepia of humanity.
And do you think that this could exacerbate the already egregious inequalities in our criminal justice system?
It already is.
Thank you very much. I yield the rest of my time to the chair.
How so?
So right now, because you have the propensity for these systems to misidentify Black individuals or brown communities more often, and you also have confirmation bias where if I have been said to be a criminal, that I am more targeted. So there's a case with Mr. Ba, an 18-year-old African-American man who was misidentified in Apple stores as a thief. And in fact, he was falsely arrested multiple times because of this kind of misidentification. And then if you have a case where we're thinking about putting, let's say, facial recognition technology on police body cams in a situation where you already have racial bias, that can be used to confirm, right, the presumption of guilt, even if that hasn't necessarily been proven, because you have these algorithms that we already have sufficient information showing fail more on communities of color.
Play a lightning round game. I'm going to be the bad guy, which I'm sure half the room would agree with anyway. And I want to get away with as much bad things as possible, ideally to enrich myself and advance my interest, even if that means putting my interests ahead of the American people. I have enlisted all of you as my co-conspirators, so you're going to help me legally get away with all of this. So, Mrs. Hobart Flynn, I want to run. If I want to run a campaign that is entirely funded by corporate political action committees, is there anything that legally prevents me from doing that?
No.
Okay, so there's nothing stopping me from being entirely funded by corporate PACs, say from the fossil fuel industry, the healthcare industry, big pharma. I'm entirely 100% lobbyist PAC funded. Okay, so let's say I'm a really, really bad guy, and let's say I have some skeletons in my closet that I need to cover up so that I can get elected. Mr. Smith, is it true that you wrote this article, this opinion piece for the Washington Post entitled, "These payments to women were unseemly, that doesn't mean they were illegal"?
Well, I can't see the piece, but I wrote a piece under that headline in the Post, so I assume that's right.
Okay, great. So, green light for hush money. I can do all sorts of terrible things. It's totally legal right now for me to pay people off. And that is considered speech. That money is considered speech. So I use my special interest dark money funded campaign to pay off folks that I need to pay off and get elected. So now I'm elected, now I'm in. I've got the power to draft, lobby, and shape the laws that govern the United States of America. Fabulous. Now, is there any hard limit that I have? Perhaps Mrs. Hobart Flynn, is there any hard limit that I have in terms of what legislation I'm allowed to touch? Are there any limits on the laws that I can write or influence especially if I'm based on the special interest funds that I accepted to finance my campaign and get me elected in the first place.
There's no limits.
So there's none. So I can be totally funded by oil and gas. I can be totally funded by Big Pharma, come in, write Big Pharma laws, and there's no limits to that whatsoever.
That's right.
Okay, so awesome. Now, Mr. Mirabani, the last thing I want to do is get rich with as little work possible. That's really what I'm trying to do as the bad guy, right? So is there anything preventing me from holding stocks, say, in an oil or gas company, and then writing laws to deregulate that industry and cause, that could potentially cause the stock value to soar and accrue a lot of money in that time?
You could do that.
So I could do that. I could do that now with the way our current laws are set up. Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. Is it possible that any elements of this story apply to our current government and our current public servants right now?
Yes.
Yes.
So we have a system that is fundamentally broken. We have these influences existing in this body, which means that these influences are here in this committee shaping the questions that are being asked of you all right now. Would you say that that's correct,
Yes.
Mr. Mirabani or Mr. Schaub?
Yes.
All right, so one last thing, Mr. Schaub. In relation to congressional oversight that we have, the limits that are placed on me as a congresswoman, compared to the executive branch and compared to, say, the President of the United States, would you say that Congress has the same sort of standard of accountability? Is there more teeth in that regulation in Congress on the president, or would you say it's about even, or more so on the federal?
In terms of laws that apply to the president, yeah, there's just almost no laws at all that apply to the president.
So I'm being held, and every person in this body is being held to a higher ethical standard than the President of the United States.
That's right, because there are some ethics committee rules that apply to you.
And it's already super legal, as we've seen, for me to be a pretty bad guy. So it's even easier for the President of the United States to be one, I would assume.
That's right.
Thank you very much.
The gentlelady yields.
Thank you, and I appreciate the gentlelady from New York's passion about the issue, and I think it's genuine, I think it's heartfelt. And I also appreciate her passion for working Americans and the need to provide for a future of prosperity for working Americans. And I want to invite the gentlelady to come to Eastern Kentucky, my home area, where thousands of coal miners no longer have paychecks. I invite her to go underground with me and meet the men and women who do heroic work to power the American economy. And I would invite the gentlelady to come to Eastern Kentucky and meet the coal miners who will tell you what the Green New Deal would
reclaim my time.
Would mean for their families, their paychecks.
With respect,
time.
I reclaim my time. I'd be happy to. In fact, when I first started my campaign, the first place I went to was to Kentucky, and I sat and I drove from the airport to where we were staying with an individual, and he was telling me his story. I'd be happy to go to Kentucky. And I'd also like to note that in the Green New Deal, one of the things that I advocate for is fully funding the pensions of coal miners in West Virginia and throughout Appalachia, because we want a just transition to make sure that we're investing in jobs across those swaths of the country. Thank you very much. It seems as though white men invoking white supremacy and engaging in mass shootings are almost immune from being labeled domestic terrorists in their violence. Mr. Ricci, the San Bernardino attack was labeled, the San Bernardino attack of December 2nd, 2015, was labeled as a domestic terrorist incident. Is that correct?
I believe so.
Mr. Austin, do you know, the June 12th, 2016 Pulse nightclub shooting was also labeled as a domestic terrorist incident, correct?
That's my understanding.
Mr. Salim, when Dylan Roof, a 21-year-old white supremacist, entered the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church and murdered 9 African-American worshipers, was that labeled as an incidence of domestic terrorism?
I don't believe it was, but there's no question that it was.
So it was, in your belief as a leader in this space, it was an incidence of domestic terrorism, but it was not labeled as such.
That's correct.
Was the white supremacist shooting at Pittsburgh Tree of Life Synagogue labeled as a domestic terrorist in this incident?
I'm not aware that it was, although then Attorney General Sessions came out and called it that, but the charges that have been brought to bear and are currently playing out in court are not ones of terrorism.
So despite all of that rhetoric that we were hearing, they weren't actually labeled, these white supremacist incidents were not labeled as domestic terrorist incidents. And I really dug into some of these distinctions. What was labeled as domestic terrorism? What was labeled as a hate crime? And I could not help but, as much as I tried to dig in and explain, I could not help but feel and see that attacks committed by Muslim Americans were almost automatically labeled as domestic terrorist incidents, yet white supremacist shooting after shooting after shooting is not. And I can't help but come to the conclusion that these labels, what's being labeled as terrorism, is almost exclusively coming down to the identity. And it seems as though white men invoking white supremacy and engaging in mass shootings are almost immune from being labeled domestic terrorists in their violence. Do you find similar patterns, Mr. Salim?
I think when we look at, and I'll just call it what it is, the terrorism that has been perpetrated against not just Jewish communities, but against Muslim communities, against Christian communities in Charleston, against Sikh communities in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, and a range of other communities that organize based on race, national origin, ethnicity, color, etc. Like these acts that take lives, I don't know how you can label these actions in the eyes of the victims or the families or the communities that are affected anything other than acts of terrorism.
So the list price is almost $2,000 in the United States. Why is it $8 in Australia? Mr. O'Day, you're the CEO of Gilead. Is it true that Gilead made $3 billion in profits from the sales of Truvada in 2018?
$3 billion in revenue.
Oh, yes, in revenue, thank you. And very quickly, the current list price is $2,000 a month in the United States, correct?
The current list price is $1,780 in the United States, and just to correct, the $3 billion was a global figure.
Okay,
for Truvada for PrEP.
So the list price is almost $2,000 in the United States. Why is it $8 in Australia?
Truvada still has patent protection in the United States, and in the rest of the world it is generic.
There's no reason this should be $2,000 a month. People are dying because of it, and there's no enforceable reason for it. Dr. Grant, Truvada for PrEP is the only known drug that can prevent the transmission of HIV, correct?
It's the only medication that's been approved by the FDA. It's also known that tenofovir alone is prophylactic for HIV.
Thank you. And Dr. Grant, it was your NIH-funded research on PrEP that built on the earlier research work patented by CDC researchers. Is that correct?
Yes. My clinical trial was informed by CDC research in two ways. One, the CDC demonstrated that the pre-exposure dose was added to the efficacy of PrEP.
Thank you, Dr. Grant. And I would also like to seek unanimous consent to submit this Yale School of Law study into the congressional record, which concludes that the CDC's patents for PrEP were both valid and enforceable against Gilead.
Ordered.
Thank you very much. Dr. Lord, thank you for your advocacy here today. Is it true that the public invested $50 million to develop PrEP?
That is correct.
Is it also true that Gilead relied on publicly funded trials to obtain FDA approval?
Yes, if you look at their supplementary new drug application, you'll see that every sponsor of Truvada S PrEP was a non-Gilead sponsor.
When folks can't access PrEP because it's so expensive and we spread, the HIV epidemic continues, that also comes at a public cost, right? So the public is paying, we paid to develop PrEP, we paid to finance the publicly funded trials to develop this drug, we also pay and foot the bill with patient assistance programs, and also we pay when the HIV epidemic gets spread as well.
And will be generically available in the United States as of September in 2020, based upon Gilead agreeing to support generic entries 1 year
So
early.
I think it's important that we notice here that we, the public, we, the people, developed this drug, we paid for this drug, we led and developed all of the grounding patents to create PrEP, and then that patent has been privatized despite the fact that the patent is owned by the public. We refuse to enforce it. There's no reason this should be $2,000 a month. People are dying because of it, and there's no enforceable reason for it. We own the core intellectual property for it, and as a result, people are dying for no reason. For no reason. The public is acting as an early investor, putting tons of money in the development of drugs that then become privatized, and then they receive no return on the investment that they have made.
Right.
You're familiar with the study that shows that between 2010 and 2016, of every drug, all 210 drugs that were approved by the FDA were funded by the NIH or public money.
Would it be correct, Dr. Kesselheim, to characterize the NIH money that is being used in development and research as an early investment?
Yes.
So the public is acting as an early investor in the production of these drugs. Is the public receiving any sort of direct return on that investment from the highly profitable drugs that are developed from that research?
No, in most cases, there is, when those products are eventually handed off to a for-profit company, there aren't licensing deals that bring money back into the coffers of the NIH. That usually doesn't happen.
So the public is acting as an early investor, putting tons of money in the development of drugs that then become privatized, and then they receive no return on the investment that they have made.
Right.
¿Sentías segura en esos centros? No.
Vinimos a Estados Unidos, donde yo esperaba construir una vida mejor y más segura para mi hija Marie. Lastimosamente, vi morir a mi niña, lenta y muy dolorosamente, unos meses antes de su segundo cumpleaños. Ella dejó de existir. Me duele revivir esta experiencia y recordar lo que yo sufrí. Pero estoy aquí porque el mundo debe saber lo que está sucediendo con tantos niños en las cárceles dentro de la detención de ICE. Mi hermosa niña se ha ido ahora, pero espero que su historia estimule al gobierno de los Estados Unidos a actuar para que niños no mueran por negligencia y maltrato que dan.
Gracias, señora Juárez, por venir aquí hoy con el valor de compartir su historia. Quiero empezar con una pregunta que es muy importante. Primeramente, la ley de los Estados Unidos requiere que los niños se mantengan en condiciones seguras y sanitarias. Usted y su hija bebé estaban aquí en estas condiciones. En la opinión de usted, ¿estas condiciones estaban seguras y sanitarias? ¿Sí o no?
No.
No estaban seguras ni sanitarias. No. Pero también También quiero preguntarle una cosa más. ¿Ha visto con sus propios ojos una cultura de crueldad adentro de estas facilidades?
Cuando yo estuve en detención en las jaulas, nos dieron una entrevista telefónicamente con los oficiales de Inmigración ICE, en la cual a mí me hablaron sobre qué era lo que yo venía a hacer en el país, a qué y por qué. Yo le respondí que yo venía a sacar adelante a mi hija, pero ellos casi no nos dejaban hablar. Y él me dijo con estas palabras: tú sabes que este es un país de americanos, que mi presidente es Donald Trump y que te podemos quitar a tu hija y a ti te podemos encerrar en la cárcel. Y yo recuerdo que yo me puse a llorar porque me quedé sin palabras como para poder responderles. Eso para mí es maltrato.
¿Recuerda si en algún momento usted o cualquier otra mujer en el centro fueron llamadas por nombres groseros por los oficiales de la patrulla fronteriza?
Nombres groseros no, pero sí palabras que a nosotros nos afectaban.
¿Y cuál palabras?
Como ustedes son inmigrantes, cosas así inofensivas. A mí no tanto, pero en solo la llamada me dijeron esas fuertes palabras en la cual me dejaron sin responderles y con el derecho y la oportunidad de responderles del por qué yo venía a este país.
¿Y sentía segura en esos centros?
No.
And Mr. Chair, I just think it's extremely important that this is noted, that this is not an issue. You know, there are debates about money and resources. That's for another day. But what is being pointed to here is a culture of cruelty. To have a CBP officer tell a migrant woman escaping unspeakable horrors in her home country and tell them this country is for Americans, and to threaten separating her from her daughter, to threaten a human rights violation, is extraordinarily concerning and at a bare minimum grounds for serious investigation by this committee and other entities.
I will be damned if the same politicians who refused to act then are going to try to come back today and say we need a middle of the road approach to save our lives. That is too much for me. So often, you know, when folks, particularly conservatives on both sides of the aisle, say, when they say that calling for a Green New Deal is, quote, too much or too extreme or too radical, no middle ground is right. Because I'm always curious, but I'm always curious when they say that, oh, it's too much. What do they actually mean by that? Is 100% clean and renewable energy too much? Is fighting for dignified jobs that pay people enough to live too much? Is proposing a solution on the scale of the climate crisis to solve it too much? No. But let me tell you what's too much for me. Here's what's too much for me. What's too much for me is politicians looking and allowing babies' blood to get poisoned in Flint for corporate profits. That is what is too much for me. What's too much for me What's too much for me is coal barons coming up to Washington, D.C., demanding bailout after tax break after bailout for themselves, and then not even paying their own miners pensions and put their own miners health care. That is what is too much for me. That is too much for me. What is too much for me is the fact that ExxonMobil knew exactly that climate change was real and man-made as far back as 1970, and instead of being part of the solution, they paid millions of dollars to lobby and lie and confuse the American public about it, endangering generations to come. That is too much for me. What is too much for me is the fact that in 1989, the year that I was born, the year that many of us were born, and in years after and right before, that politicians were first informed by NASA, that Congress was first notified by NASA that climate change was going to threaten my life and everyone here's life to come, and they did nothing. That is too much for me. And I will be damned if the same politicians who refused to act then are going to try to come back today and say we need a middle of the road approach to save our lives. That is too much for me. To save ourselves, and that's exactly what. This is a pattern about some people being subject to the rule of law and others not. I think that this taps into a deeper narrative and a deeper pattern of what is happening out of this administration, where they believe that the rule of law only belongs and applies to some people and not others. Right here and now, we're about 20 years away from the Central Park 5, where the president put out a full-page ad demanding the death penalty for 5 Black and brown boys. They were not yet 18 years old, demanding the death penalty for something they were accused of and innocent of. And here we have just documented evidence of multiple times of violation of the same law, and he won't even issue a slap on the wrist.
Let me know when the jail sentence starts.
This is a pattern about some people being subject to the rule of law and others not. And when that happens, there is no rule of law at all. At all. And that's why it's important that we make sure that everyone is held accountable, because whether it's a billionaire, whether it's an administration official, or whether it's a postal worker or a kid on the street, we all must be held accountable to the same extent by the rule of law. In 2019, in an era where we think that we have insulin for sale, and we try to skim off the profits of life-saving medications, it is radical to believe that caring for our veterans should not be for sale in America. And here's the thing, they are trying to fix it. But who are they trying to fix it for, is the question we gotta ask. And this is who they're trying to fix it for. They're trying to fix the VA for pharmaceutical companies. They're trying to fix the VA for insurance corporations. And ultimately, they're trying to fix the VA for a for-profit healthcare industry that does not put people or veterans first. And so we have a responsibility to protect it. Because if it is any community that deserves Cadillac, first-class healthcare in the United States of America, it is our military service members and veterans. Period. People talk about the advocacy that comes from our district and the advocacy that comes from me as though it's this big, radical, scary, crazy thing. And you know why they say it's so radical and so crazy? You know, it's this big, radical belief at the core of what we advocate for is because we believe that some things should not be for sale in this country. An approach that we have seen when it comes to privatization is the idea that this thing that isn't broken, this thing that provides some of the highest quality care to our veterans somehow needs to be fixed, optimized, tinkered with until we don't even recognize it anymore. And so when we talk about the VA, we need to talk about protecting the VA. And if we really want to fix the VA so badly, let's start hiring and filling up some of those 49,000 vacancies that haven't been hired.
The United States is running concentration camps on our southern border, and that is exactly what they are. They are concentration camps. If that doesn't bother you, we can have, okay, whatever. I want to talk to the people that are concerned enough with humanity to say that we should not, that never again means something. And that the fact that concentration camps are now an institutionalized practice in the home of the free is extraordinarily disturbing.
Does she not owe every Jew on this planet an apology? Has she ever been to Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, or Auschwitz-Birkenau in southern Poland, or Dachau in Germany? Never again is the phrase that Jews all over the world use to make sure that the extermination between 1939 and 1945 never happens again. And she's using concentration camps to describe what's happening on the southern border. How in the world is that acceptable?
You know, I don't use those words lightly. I don't use those words to just throw bombs. I use that word because that is what an administration that creates concentration camps is. A presidency that creates concentration camps is fascist. And it's very difficult to say that because it is very difficult to accept the fact that that is how bad things have gotten. But that is how bad things have gotten. Madam Chair, I rise today to offer this critical bipartisan amendment that will allow United States researchers to study and examine the extraordinary promise shown by several Schedule I drugs that have been shown in treating critical diseases such as MDMA's success in veteran PTSD, psilocybin's promise in treatment-resistant depression, or ibogaine effectiveness in opioid and other drug addiction. Additionally, this will allow research into marijuana's impact in cancer relief, seizure treatment, and more. This amendment strikes a war on drugs provision that prohibits any activity, quote, promoting the legalization of any drug included in Schedule I of the Controlled Substance Act. The problem with this provision is that it is so vague and broadly interpreted that it prevents scientists from researching, examining, and exploring avenues of treatment that could alleviate an enormous amount of suffering from medical conditions.
I don't think this is what the government should be promoting, and I think we should have a lot more research before we tell our kids that this is what they should be doing, and I yield the balance.
My colleague across the aisle said, we need to research this more, and I agree, and that is why this amendment is being introduced, Madam Chair. The note was brought up that there is a rider provision saying that there is an exception for those drugs that have been shown medical promise, but we cannot prove that medical promise unless we fund the research to actually have it in the first place. So we have a catch-22, and we have to get rid of it. There are war on drugs provisions in so many federal statutes beyond just the one scheduling of these drugs. I'm a strong believer in evidence-based policymaking, and wherever there is evidence of good, we have a moral obligation to pursue and explore the parameters of that good, even if it means challenging our past assumptions or admitting past wrongs. 30% of all military veterans have considered suicide. 30%. So if a substance shows promise in treating PTSD, we have an obligation to study it. One of the leading causes of death in America today is suicide. So if a Schedule I drug shows clinical promise in treating and in treatment-resistant depression, perhaps it is not the drug we should say is morally wrong, but perhaps it is the law, the schedule, the statute. Moreover, I'm proud to say that this is a bipartisan amendment. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle often bemoan the role of government and promote ideas of choice. And here I am happy in that spirit to agree, to say we should get government and political opinion out of scientific research when we have seen and showed promise in a way that can help people and their medical needs. And lastly, I understand that the politics of this bill may make it difficult for some to support right now. But I propose this amendment and urge my colleagues to support it because politics isn't always about winning today, but it is about fighting for what is right in the future and for future generations.
Justice is not a concept we read about in a book. Justice is about the water we drink. Justice is about the air we breathe. Justice is about how easy it is to vote. Justice is about how much ladies get paid.